Even as His Holiness, the Dalai Lama has assured his followers that he is in good health and that according to his dreams he may live up to 110 years, the Chinese regime appears to be preparing for the succession struggle. Wang Huning, the ideology czar and the chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, recently attended an exhibition on the reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist leaders at the China Tibetological Research Center. Now, this center has always maintained that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama and other significant living Buddhas has historically been approved by the central Chinese authorities. This also goes to show that the Chinese regime and the institutions related to Tibet are actively working on a succession plan. The Chinese government calls the idea of the Dalai Lama's followers that he should be allowed to decide on his reincarnation as political motivations. This also goes to show that despite all the bravado, the Chinese regime is anxious and worried about the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. To discuss the reincarnation issues and the Chinese anxieties, we have with us Shri Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary and author.
Yes. Namaskar and welcome to Samvad at Mayank, sir. And thank you for sparing time for us. Sir, I must acknowledge that this discussion basically stems from your article for Carnegie India, which it's a beautiful article on the next Dalai Lama preparing for reincarnation and why it matters to India. So this was the trigger for this whole discussion, which has come to fructify now. Sir, as you wrote in the article, that Wang Huning recently visited the China Tibetology Research Center. And we all know that China Tibetology Research Center basically deals with the Chinese ideas for Tibet. Sir, I mean, we have seen that sects, religious sects, basically decide on successions through reincarnations or whatever method they deem fit for their sect. But somehow China does not seem to be believing that. They say, call it the politically motivated people. So my basically idea is to get your sense of understanding as to why China is so interested in the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Why is it so anxious?
Thank you, Mayankji, for having me on your program. Let me begin by saying that His Holiness the Dalai Lama as an institution is important to the spiritual and political life of Tibet. Because since the 14th century, the Dalai Lamas have been seen as the temporal heads of Tibet. Now, China claims that right from the 13th century onwards, Tibet has become an integral part of China. But that is not factually correct. There were invasions off and on by the Chinese in Tibet, but China was never able to completely integrate Tibet, and therefore the Dalai Lamas remained the temporal head of Tibet for many centuries until the mid-18th century, when the Chinese emperors belonging to the Qing dynasty were able to take greater control of Tibet. Now, essentially, in the end of the 18th century, in 1793, the Emperor Qianlong issued an ordinance in which he stated that Tibet would be a part of China, that China would station a governor or a viceroy in Tibet to indicate that Chinese ruled Tibet. And one of the stipulations therein was that the Dalai Lama would be selected and approved by the Chinese government in Beijing. And they created a new way of doing so called the Golden Urn method, which is that several possible candidates' names would be put into a golden bowl, and on the basis of certain rituals and procedures, one name would be selected. Now, of course, this rule was never followed entirely. For example, in the case of some Dalai Lamas, after 1793, the rule was followed. In other cases, it was not followed. But today, the People's Republic of China finds it convenient to claim its control over the selection of the Dalai Lama based on the Imperial Treaty of 1793. What is ironical is that almost all other treaties that the Chinese imperial governments or other governments signed with other countries, including with what was then British India, has been rejected by the People's Republic of China. But in this particular case, because it suits them, they have maintained that this ordinance is valid and that what the Qing Empire did in 1793 remains valid today. Now, why is it important, therefore, for the Chinese to select the next Dalai Lama? Well, it is important because the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, who now lives in exile in India, never accepted fully the 17-point agreement signed between China and Tibet, by which Tibet became what is called an autonomous region of the People's Republic of China. And this agreement, which was signed in 1951, was signed against the wishes of the 14th Dalai Lama, the current one. And subsequently, through the 1950s, he grew more and more concerned that the Chinese were intent on fully controlling Tibetan society and religion. And eventually, of course, in 1959, he fled into exile. Now, ever since then, the Chinese have been anxious because of the Dalai Lama's stature and influence in Tibet. And that anxiety has never dissipated over the last 60 odd years that His Holiness has been in India. Therefore, they are very keen that when His Holiness passes, and since His Holiness is already 90 years of age, there is reason to believe that he is nearing the end of his life. They will want to select the next Dalai Lama, the 15th Dalai Lama, in such a way that that person is loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and to the People's Republic of China. That is the real reason why the Chinese are making such efforts to control the process of selection of the Dalai Lama.
But there is something about Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism, I would say, which seems to make the Chinese very wary. Now, what makes them so wary about not China, the Chinese Communist Party, I must say, the rulers? Why are they so wary? Because the Tibetans, they culturally, they are shrinking because of the policies of the Chinese government. But even then, that wariness has not gone away from Tibet and both Tibetan Buddhism. What is it about them?
Well, let me begin by talking first about religion in general, because as you know, communism rejects all religions. Karl Marx declared that religion is the opium of the masses, and that the communists do not believe that there is such a thing called religion or spirituality. So, in any case, at its very foundation, the Chinese state and the Communist Party reject the idea of religion. But in fact, what happened between 1978, when the reforms took place, and roughly 2010, was that the Chinese Communist Party tolerated religion. It accommodated the religious beliefs because it understood that a large part of Chinese society believed in religion. It believed in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Islam, and that it was not possible to eliminate it completely. And so essentially what the Chinese state and the Communist Party did were to accommodate it within a certain set of restraints, which prevented religion from entering into politics, but allowed people to practice their own faith. Now, what has happened since 2010, and especially after the current leader, President Xi Jinping, has come to office, is a growing sense that religion is being used by others, especially external forces, to subvert the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, at various times, they have been concerned about the external influence on their own populations practicing Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. And since 2004, therefore, the Chinese Communist Party has begun a systematic set of rules and regulations which limit the influence of religion on society and politics. And this particular effort has gained speed when President Xi Jinping has come to office. The main focus is to ensure that social stability is maintained and that political control of all elements in society, including religious establishments, remain in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So what they've really done after 20 successive regulations have been brought in to control any kind of foreign role in religious preaching, in religious conversions, in financial support to religious institutions from abroad, in the training of priests and imams and Buddhist monks, and of course, eventually also in trying to prevent external agencies like the Vatican or Islamic scholars outside China from controlling the religious sentiments of the Chinese people. Now, the controls on Tibetan Buddhism have to be seen within this broader policy. And this broader policy has now evolved from merely ensuring social stability to now demanding that religious groups in China owe loyalty to the Communist Party. In other words, they accept that the Communist Party of China is the guiding principle on which the state runs, and all religion must also run on this principle. And therefore, essentially what we are seeing is a Chinese policy response to what it fears that as a concern, which is that religious activity might be politically destabilizing to the Chinese Communist Party. So far as Tibet is concerned, of course, the problem is aggravated or exacerbated by the fact that this particular religion is in an ethnically and religiously distinct area from mainland China. First, because it is a Buddhist majority part of China. Tibetan Buddhism is exclusive to this region. But secondly, because the Tibetans are ethnically different from the Han Chinese. And third, because it is a border region and therefore it has a bearing on China's national security. And for these reasons, therefore, their focus is very strong on Tibetan Buddhism and on Tibet. And that's why we see a lot of regulations aimed at controlling religion in Tibet, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, as well as in terms of selection of the lamas there.
So is that what you refer to in your paper as sinicizing the religions? Xi Jinping's policy of sinicizing all religions. I mean, how does it work? I would like you to elaborate a bit on how do these regulations actually work? Because I find it very ironical that a party, an ideology which is atheist basically at its core, wants all religions to owe allegiance to that party. So I find it very ironical and paradoxical. So what are a few regulations as to by which they want to sinicize all religions?
Yeah, so I don't think it is as ironical as it looks, Mayanji, because the Chinese have always believed that foreigners have used religion to bring about political change in China. And in particular, they felt that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western civilizations used their control over Christian missionaries and Christianity in China to weaken the Chinese state. Now, after 1949, when the People's Republic of China took over, this concern extended to other religions which had external roots, in particular Islam, because the Islamic population of China again is located in a very sensitive northwestern part in the borderlands of China. And thereafter, it was also a concern where Tibetan Buddhism was concerned, because after the Dalai Lama fled to India and a number of other senior Tibetan religious leaders fled to India, China was concerned that countries, outside countries, might use the Dalai Lama or other leaders to influence the situation inside Tibet. So broadly speaking, the worry that the Chinese have always had is that religion, the Chinese people will be used to subvert the Chinese Communist Party through their religious belief. Now, sinicization therefore meant that essentially the doctrine, the people who preach that religion, the institutions of those religions should be run by the Chinese for the Chinese and should not have to depend on external support either in terms of preaching or in terms of money or in terms of institutions. Because once you sinicize religion or you make it controlled by the Chinese, your control over that religious group increases. Therefore, the regulations after 2015 are designed to prevent foreigners from interfering in Chinese religion. In other words, China will not allow foreign preachers to come and do missionary work in China. They will not allow Chinese religious scholars to be trained abroad. They will not permit foreign internet teachings via the digital method to Chinese. They will not allow foreign NGOs to support Chinese religious activities. They will not allow the Vatican, for instance, to appoint Catholic priests and cardinals. That is what is meant by sinicization of religion. And given our own experience in this regard, I think there is some amount of understanding of the Chinese psychology that we should have in this, because there has been interference from outside where religion in India is concerned as well. But of course, in India, our constitution guarantees all religions the right to select their leaders and to practice their faith unhindered, provided they are within the constitution and the law. That is the ethos of the Indian state. Of course, the ethos of the Chinese state is they must control every aspect of human life within their boundary. And therefore, they have talked of sinicization of religion.
So now I would like to shift a bit to perhaps the biggest cause of this wariness for China on the Tibetan side, the US effect, I would say. I mean, we have seen the whole range of US-China relations, starting from the US refusal to accept the Chinese Communist Party as the rulers, as the leaders, accepting Chiang Kai-shek, the Korean War, then the ping-pong diplomacy, and back to, I mean, the initial stages of a bit of hostility right now. And we have seen these three acts. In 2002, the US Congress Tibetan Policy Act. In 2020, the Tibetan Policy Support Act. And in 2024, the Resolve Tibet Act. Now, coming back to your paper, sir, you say that these acts are basically leading to a securitization of the reincarnation issue. So what exactly is this? But before you come to the securitization of the reincarnation issue, I would like you to give us a brief overview of these three acts.
Well, let me first begin by saying that the US position on Tibet has not been consistent. In 1949 and in 1950, when the Chinese invaded Tibet, the United States did not initially support the Dalai Lama's appeal to the Western governments for help. It was only after the Chinese fought the Americans in the Korean War in the early 1950s and in the Taiwan Strait in 1954-55 that the United States changed its policy on Tibet. And it told the Dalai Lama that if he rejected the 17-point agreement of 1951, which made Tibet a part of the People's Republic of China, then the United States government would be prepared to recognize the Dalai Lama as the head of an autonomous Tibet. And subsequently, as you know, the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, also armed and supported the Khampa rebellion in eastern Tibet, which of course did not succeed. Now, this support for the Tibetans and for the Dalai Lama changed once again in the early 1970s after the visit of President Richard Nixon to the United States and the normalization of relations between China and the US in 1979. In fact, for 20 years after 1971, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was not able to visit the United States, and Tibet receded into the background because the United States was keen to develop political relations with China, and they did not want Tibet to become a thorn in the flesh. It was only in the late 1980s that the Tibet issue once again became a hot button topic in the US. And it began first in the United States Congress. It was members of the US Congress who took up the Tibetan cause, including such people like Nancy Pelosi, and also Hollywood stars like Richard Gere. And subsequently, public opinion grew in the United States. And in the early 90s, the presidents of the United States, President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama, all received His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and Tibet began to regain influence in the public mind as concern grew in the United States about the human rights situation in China. Now, this has led over a period of the next 20 years of this century to 3 acts being passed by the United States Congress. You correctly pointed out it was in 2002, in 2020, and the most recent one was just last year in 2024. What do these acts do? Well, broadly, they do 3 things. Firstly, they raise doubts about China's historical claim on Tibet. In a sense, the act rejects the Chinese claim that it had sovereignty over Tibet for centuries and centuries, and it says that Tibet was more or less an independent state through much of this period and subject to Chinese control only sporadically. This is a very important point because it supports the Tibetan argument that they were never a part of China until after 1949, when the current government invaded Tibet and forced it to become part of China. The second thing the act does is that it specifically opposes the Chinese claim that it has the right to select the Dalai Lama by saying that all religions should be free to choose their leaders without foreign interference, and this is applicable to Tibetan Buddhism as well, and that this was the tradition followed right from the inception of the position of the Dalai Lama in the late 14th and early 15th century. So in other words, it rejects the Chinese claim that the 1793 ordinance allows it to determine who the Dalai Lama will be. And thirdly, most importantly, it makes it mandatory for the United States government to actively oppose this process by collaborating with foreign governments and by raising public awareness internationally that what China is doing in terms of selecting the Dalai Lama is not appropriate, and it is not. It should be resisted. So these 3 acts taken together, in a sense, challenge the Chinese claim very substantially that it has the right to appoint the Dalai Lama. And because these are the 2 most powerful countries in the world, the US position obviously is something which is of concern to the Chinese. I think that can be well understood. And therefore, China has rejected all these 3 pieces of legislation. And it says that the only intention of the United States and the West is to use Tibetan Buddhism to infiltrate into China via the religious route in order to subvert the Chinese Communist Party. So this is really the crux of the issue. And because these are 2 very powerful countries, their contradictory positions on Tibet will have an impact on the rest of the world's view in this situation as well. And therefore, the Chinese are particularly concerned that other countries do not support this Western view. And therefore, the campaign globally by the Chinese also to state that they have a reasonable case in terms of controlling Tibet, and they want the rest of the world to recognize their legitimacy, including their right to appoint the Dalai Lama.
Sure. So the final question, and it stems from the previous one only, that basically what we are seeing, that the number of people who say that maybe the US and its allies, they should be taking a softer stand towards the whole issue of China, particularly concerning Tibet and Tibetans. And because it, as you said, it's leading to a securitization of the reincarnation issue, also securitization of whole lot of issues. But China has its policy cast in stone. So do you see that a moderation of stand from the rest of the world, particularly West, will perhaps lead to a softer stance from China, or maybe the pressure from the West will pressure the Chinese to go soft on the Tibetans? Which of these two probabilities is possible?
Well, let's be clear. I think the principal concern that the Chinese have is not the Americans, it is their own control inside Tibet. They have been able to establish themselves militarily in Tibet and to a certain degree economically. But the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama remains popular even 60 years after leaving Tibet signals to them, at least in their minds, that political control over Tibet is still tenuous. Now, this concern is increased by the fact that their own selection of the Panchen Lama, the second highest Lama in Tibet in 1997, has never been fully recognized by the Tibetan people. As you know, the Dalai Lama appointed a Panchen Lama and the Chinese appointed their own Panchen Lama. The Dalai Lama appointed Panchen Lama is missing, believed to be in prison in Tibet or in China. But the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama has never been fully accepted inside Tibet, which has led the Chinese to conclude that even after 70 years of political control and economic progress, the Tibetan people still believe that the Dalai Lama, who is living outside China, is their religious head. And therefore, there is a certain anxiety in the Chinese state that if he passes on and his successor is not found within China and is not within Chinese control, the Tibetan people will have yet another opportunity to challenge the Chinese state and will never be fully accepting of the control of the People's Republic of China on Tibet. For this reason, therefore, the Chinese want to control and to appoint the Dalai Lama. This is the crux of the issue. Now, on this matter, the anxiety is then increased by the fact that this world's most powerful country and the West in general are also supporting an independent selection of the Dalai Lama, which means that political support globally, financially, is available to the Tibetan movement and to the Tibetan Buddhist movement. So they therefore feel that when the United States backs this, the claim that Tibetans must be free to choose their own leader, the Chinese feel that this will then increase the possibility of political instability in Tibet and a challenge to their control. And so this is, it sort of magnifies the problem. In this whole mix, India also then becomes important because it is the only state bordering the Tibet Autonomous Region. The United States or the West does not have a direct access to it. And therefore, the Chinese feel that India's stand in the matter is crucial because if India tilts towards the Western stand, then it magnifies the problem for them because the boundary with Tibet is essentially with India. And therefore, it leaves open the possibility that at a certain point of time, at least in their minds, this territorial contiguity might be used to subvert China or to subvert the Chinese control in Tibet. So it's a sort of multiple factors which is causing this anxiety and leading the Chinese to take this drastic action to bring the Tibetan Buddhism firmly under control through the appointment of their own nominee as the next Dalai Lama.
Sir, what I find in the whole story is it is a story of human fortitude where people who have been driven out of their country and a holy figure who is 90 years old still raises the anxiety of perhaps the most security controlled nation in the world. Now, this is something which is very remarkable. What can I say? I mean, it's a victory of human spirit over anything else. And
Yes, indeed, it tells us that when the human spirit believes in something, it cannot be eliminated through administrative or even military means. And the best example, in fact, is the Russian Orthodox Church, which was virtually eliminated by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union for over 70 years. But immediately after the disintegration of the Communist Party, it bounced back and today is the driving spiritual force in Russia. And therefore, it is, of course, a debatable point as to how successful the Chinese will be in controlling religion or in eliminating foreign influences in religion or in controlling the belief of the people. Because past historical experience, not just in Russia, but in many other countries, has shown that what is most difficult to control is the spiritual or the belief systems of people. And therefore, we have to see what the future holds. We don't know.
so this is such a vast issue, but it's a privilege listening to you, sir.
Thank you.
I would like to come back to you because we have raised the India issue with sometime in future. I would like to come back to you with for the India, China, and Tibet issue discussion. But thank you so much for sparing time for us, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope
Thank
your
you.
listeners also read the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.